for our continued use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. Thank you all for tuning in. Town Hall is proud to be a community-focused organization and a place where we can share and sustain ideas and creativity, even if it means we can't gather in person. I'd like to thank Eddie and Shaun for appearing tonight to help make that possible. Town Hall will be continuing to produce virtual content this fall, and many of our past talks are available in video or podcast form from our digital media library. Check out our calendar for upcoming events at townhallseattle.org. Town Hall and the nonprofit community at large have been put under significant strain due to the ever-changing landscape. We hope you will consider extending your generosity to help support us during this difficult time by making a donation by clicking the donate button at the bottom of your screen or becoming a member. Our partner booksellers have also been hit by the negative effects of COVID and can use your support as well. If you're interested in purchasing a copy of the book being presented tonight, please use the link on this live stream page to purchase through Third Place Books. For viewers who want to watch this broadcast with closed captioning, we recommend viewing the stream via our YouTube page that's linked here in the chat. To enable real-time closed captioning, click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. Tonight's presentation will be about an hour, including Q&A. Eddie and Shaun will select questions from those submitted in the Ask a Question field at the bottom of your screen. You can also submit questions on the YouTube chat. You can vote as well. If you're watching on Crowdcast, you can vote on the questions to be addressed by clicking the arrow next to the question to upvote it. We can't guarantee that we'll get to every question, but we'll get to as many as possible. Please keep your questions concise and in the form of a question. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Civic Series is supported by Real Networks Foundation, True Brown Foundation, KUOW, and the Wyncote Foundation Northwest. Finally, Town Hall is a member-supported organization, so I want to thank all of the members watching tonight. Now on to the program. Shaun Scott is a Seattle-based writer and historian, a former Pramila Jayapal staffer, 2019 Seattle City Council candidate, and Bernie Sanders' 2020 Washington State Field Director. His essays about popular culture and late capitalism have appeared in Sports Illustrated and The Guardian, among others. He is the author of Millennials and the Moments That Made Us, a cultural history of the U.S. from 1982 to the present. Eddie R. Cole, PhD, is an associate professor of higher education and organizational change at UCLA, with a teaching repertoire that includes courses on the history of higher education, the history of special mission colleges and universities like HBCUs, higher education curriculum development, and global studies, and a global studies higher education course. His scholarship and public writing has also been featured in the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. He's been the recipient of numerous prestigious awards and recognitions, including receiving the 2018 Early Career Award from the Association of the Study of Higher Education, which recognizes outstanding contributions to research that advances understanding of higher education. He has also received a number of research fellowships and grants from Princeton University and the University of Chicago, and has been a Dean's Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Cole's debut book, The Campus Color Line, College Presidents and the Struggle for Black Freedom, is the topic of tonight's talk. Please join me in welcoming Eddie Cole and Shaun Scott.
Well, if these were normal circumstances, we would have waited a second for the inevitable round of applause that would have taken place there. But since we're all joining here digitally with one another, we can get right into it. Eddie, you're joining us from Los Angeles. I'm talking here in Seattle. How are you doing?
I'm hanging in there, right? I'm hanging in there these days, but I'm well overall. How about yourself?
I'm doing okay. I'm doing good.
Yeah.
It's been a really eventful news day. A lot of people, glued to their phones right now, as a lot of us have been since March, with everything that's going on with COVID, with a new civil rights movement or moment taking shape in the streets of pretty much every major American city. If you're on the West Coast, like we are right now, the sun was not visible for about 2 or 3 weeks that there. something we're kind of used to in Seattle, but nonetheless, seeing a yellow sky was not how I think a lot of us spent New Year's Day 2020 thinking we were going to be looking at this year. So my first question to you really is, it's about the opening quote in your book. It begins with a quote from Edwin Harrison, who was the president of the Georgia Institute of Technology from 1957 to 1969. Yeah. And he says to a group of students, and I quote, "You people seem to have been born into a time of crisis," end quote. Yeah. So for a book that uses kind of the American university as a kind of microcosm for the larger struggle for racial justice, what are just sort of your observations right now about this surreal and in some ways very inspiring time that we've been living through this summer with the new civil rights movement materializing in our streets?
Wow. One, thanks for having me, and what a great opening question to really get into it. That moment, and let me just paint the scene for those who haven't read the book just yet. So that quote is, there are about 2,000 students at Georgia Tech huddled into the old gymnasium because a week earlier, the University of Georgia desegregated, admitting 2 Black students, and there was a racial riot in response to the students enrolling at the formerly segregated University of Georgia. And so all of a sudden there was concern at Georgia Tech about what's going to happen on that campus, because at the time it was also an all-white university. And so the president stands there and just lays it out plain. It's the first words out of his mouth and what becomes a very lively Q&A with students. And it's a time of crisis, and that's applicable to this moment. And you can imagine that university leaders across the nation right now, regardless of their region, regardless of whether they lead a public or private institution, and regardless of whether it's a historically white or predominantly white or all white institution compared to a historically Black college or predominantly Black institution, they're all grappling with this moment of crisis that we're in right now. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's fair game to think of this moment as a continuation, I would say, of an ongoing civil rights movement, but certainly a peak in that it's unique within itself. And so there's so many parallels between the past and the present, and what we're grappling with, these same issues that Edwin Harrison laid out, the time of crises, if you will, in 1961. Those same issues are on the table right now, Shaun. Right. I mean, seriously, I mean, we're still having the same questions about who can or can't go to certain colleges. Mm-hmm. Right, which was the issue right before Edwin Harrison at Georgia Tech in 1961. But there are also questions around housing discrimination and how universities continue to expand. There are questions around free speech on campus. Affirmative action continues to be in the courts right now. These are all issues covered in the book, and all issues that were really coming together to really make the civil rights movement, or the modern civil rights movement through the 1950s and 60s that we're most commonly discussing. Yeah. Right.
And your book does deal primarily with, on the text of it anyway, the immediate post-World War II generation. But I think it's pretty obvious that, as you mentioned, the questions that are begged by those movements, which so many of us have gotten so much inspiration from, unfortunately, those questions are not any less relevant in the 50s and 60s than they are sitting here and talking in 2020. Before we get into the content of it, we talk a lot, when we're talking to artists in terms of inspiration and creativity, that somehow I think that discourse is not as prevalent for academics in an academic space where I think notions of objectivity and so-called impartiality are really prized. So I'm curious for you, just on a personal level. I know that you've written a few journal articles, one of them Race and Rhetoric, an analysis of college presidents, also Race to the Top, historical insights on the college presidency and racial inequities. Yeah. How did the interest in this particular topic, which you've been writing about and researching for many years, come about for you personally as a scholar and as a writer?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I love that question, because this book is obviously, it's my origin story in the sense that it's personal and professional, right? I mean, obviously we're seeing the front facing professional aspect, but yeah, there is a personal component to it. And let me just say, so I grew up in Bowler, Alabama. I don't know, Shaun, have you heard of it?
I can't
No.
front. I have not.
Okay.
Alabama, I heard of. I can think about that. But, yeah.
So the short story is I grew up in rural West Alabama, which it's the rural Black South, right? Whatever you can think of the U.S. South in that sense, predominantly Black county. And, coming of age at my time frame, it's post segregation, but still segregated, right? In all the ways you can imagine. And so I went actually to a predominantly Black public high school, which was, a quarter of a mile away from a predominantly white private academy, which isn't uncommon in the rural, in the South. I mean, that popped up all over the South once the Brown versus Board of Education decision was made in 54. But ultimately, I share that to say that I always had in the back of my mind these questions about educational leaders of the past and their decisions that still shape the present, right? I mean, this is me, to be fair, I'm a teenager. I'm not thinking critically about this, but I can make sense of it even at that age, that there were some decisions made well before I came along that shaped my educational experience in the present. And so that had always stayed in the back of my mind. And by the time I went on to formally study the history of higher education, I really wanted to know more about college presidents, because that impact being even larger than, say, my small town school system. These college presidents and their past decisions in shaping the present. And I just give a little context because this project really has a decade lifetime, if you will, in the making. And we can go back to the Occupy Wall Street movement, I want to say around 2011, 2012, to where there's considerable amount of young activism, asking questions about capitalism in America and challenging universities as well to be upfront about their role in a capitalistic society. And then we get to 2015, and there's the University of Missouri, Black students protest there over racial incidents on campus. So when you start thinking about these major incidents happening and everybody looking at college presidents, I want to know, well, what's the history behind college presidents grappling with these issues? Because there's a lot of contemporary interest in the college presidency that oftentimes react to incidents as if it's a one-off. But historically speaking, we know that these issues of race, these issues of economic inequities are very old issues embedded within institutions of higher education. So it really became this sort of thing that I've been thinking about leaders for a long time since a child. And then these major moments started happening in my career that I wanted to study and learn more about.
Right. And I think, for a lot of our listeners, folks who are joining us in this conversation right now, most of us, I assume, from Seattle, the idea of coming up in or observing a space that is segregated, despite the fact that segregated was supposed to have ended, at least in the Seattle context, in 1968. The city council passes an open housing ordinance, but there are still really, really stark racial divides in the ground that exist that have not been transcended. You write in the introduction of your book, and I quote, "The campus color line is a history of the Black freedom movement as seen through the actions of college presidents. The most pressing civil rights issues, desegregation, equal educational and employment opportunity, fair housing, free speech, economic disparities, were intertwined with higher education. Therefore, the college presidency is a prism through which to disclose how colleges and universities have challenged or preserved the many enduring forms of anti-Black racism in the United States," end quote. Powerful prose. Can you talk to us about a particular episode or struggle in the American campus in the mid-20th century that sort of highlights the fight around these most pressing civil rights issues of the day that you identify?
Oh, wow. Absolutely. One thing that jumps out to me that I really want to share with this audience is likely largely Seattle, like you said, housing discrimination in America, particularly federal housing Act coming through the 1940s and 1950s, is largely shaped in part by college presidents. And I'll give you an example, right? So we know about restrictive covenants and very hard form segregation that occurs post World War I. So we're talking about the 1920s and the 1930s, but eventually we get to a Supreme Court case outlaws, bans the idea of a racial restrictive covenant. So that's not legal. So the next thing that happens is, well, what about urban renewal programs come along, right, to challenge slum areas in major urban, major cities across America? And this one particular episode is interesting because what we see is there are communities of color, Black neighborhoods, but not only Black Americans, but communities of color that are overcrowded because physical space to where more people migrating to cities can't live. It's just as simple, right? And so that's where you get the overcrowded conditions, and what white leaders, white municipal leaders turn to and just call it slum and blight, and they have to do something about it. But ultimately, a lot of those overcrowded cities, what I just document in the book, such as the South Side of Chicago, the Hyde Park community, where the University of Chicago is located, borders the Woodlawn community and Washington Park community, which were predominantly Black. And so the overcrowding really encroaches on Hyde Park. And that's when university presidents, the chancellors and so forth really came together. In 1957 in particular, there's a meeting between the leaders, the chancellor at the University of Chicago, Lawrence Kipton, the president of Harvard, the president of MIT, University of Pennsylvania, all of these major influential universities come together and they start to lobby with federal officials and say, if we can earmark millions of dollars toward these universities, they can buy the property, displace disproportionate numbers of households of color, and ultimately expand their campus footprint, but also preserve their communities that they live in. And so, just talk about a blatant example of just how race works within the American university context and how we still grapple with those issues. And within the book, I mentioned Seattle University actually being an example of an institution that partners with the University of Chicago and lobbies on the federal level in Washington, D.C., and gets millions of dollars poured into these universities to preserve their community. So instead of investing in the communities themselves, oftentimes we see these universities took federal money and invested within themselves. Yeah.
And it's, the Seattle University example, I think, is a really pertinent one because Seattle University is basically situated in what has historically been the heart of Black Seattle, a neighborhood in the Central District that's situated really, really close to Capitol Hill, where pretty much every home lot in Capitol Hill in the mid-20th century was subject to one of the racially restrictive housing covenants that you mentioned, deeds that are written into the or language that's written into the property deeds of various home lots that explicitly excludes Black folks, in many cases Jewish folks, people of Asian descent, pretty much anybody who's not white from a lot of these areas. At the same time, a lot of Seattle University, despite this history that you call attention to, has kind of the cachet of being a haven of liberalism. It is the place in the 50s and 60s where police officers are sent for cultural sensitivity training following a mayoral report on the malfeasance of the Seattle Police Department in the mid-50s. So there's kind of this this history, which I think is probably relatable to a lot of people, about institutions with the progressive, forward-thinking face on the one hand, but then when you actually follow the money, and I appreciate that you started this conversation off talking about race and capitalism as intertwined, where you actually follow the money, you see it's really a different case. So we're having this conversation, obviously, where I think professional sports is taking a lead in framing a lot of these conversations about police accountability and about racial justice. And this sort of idea that actually basketball players and football players taking a lead in forwarding this narrative has actually made the sport unwatchable to a lot of folks who would prefer that athletes stick to dribbling. Shut up and play, as the saying goes. So I guess my question is, could you talk to us about how sports were sort of politicized on the college campus in the first post-World War II period? If you have examples of how this discourse around athletics and inequity right now has an ancestor in earlier struggles in the mid-20th century?
Yeah, absolutely. There are a number of examples in the book. That's a great question. I'm glad you asked, because in sports appear in so many different ways throughout the book. But I give a couple quick examples for the sake of our conversation. One is UCLA, right? I'm gonna pick on my own university where I work, and there's the Freedom Rise happened in 1962. And ultimately, it's a challenge to segregated public facilities in the U.S. South. And so people take the buses and they stop at bus stations and so forth and try to challenge, white waiting rooms versus colored waiting rooms, right? And so a number of UCLA students actually go down south in 61 and they participate in the summer 1961 in the Freedom Rise. They're arrested and they have to come back, and they have to come back to Mississippi eventually and make a court appearance. So there's bail money involved. And some UCLA students wanting to support their peers who were arrested down south and says, how about we take student government funds and earmark some of that to help our classmates stay in school while they fight the good fight down south, challenging segregation. And there becomes a big debacle around the University of California system and can public funds be used for a social cause like that, right? So there's conservative California butting heads against sort of liberal thinking activists as well. And sports, believe it or not, ends up being how the UCLA chancellor, much to the dismay and disagreement of the University of California system president, right? Because briefly, the University of California has multiple campuses. There's a president for the system, but each campus has a chancellor. The chancellor at UCLA uses sports in a way that's very strategic. It's kind of savvy that when students are voting on yes or no to earmark these funds for their peers, the chancellor releases a statement on UCLA saying that it will no longer play universities that have segregated policies, be it segregated audience, the crowd, segregated teams, so playing teams down south that only have white players, or require Black student athletes at UCLA in the 60s to stay in one place compared to white, so any form of segregation that, say, the University of Houston may have had in Texas, UCLA and the UC system says they're not going to do it anymore. Sports used as a pivot to not say what the chancellor thought should happen, but actually sort of nudge the vote. This announcement happened while students were voting, February 14th and 15th, 1962, right? So that's just one example of how sports were used in one way. But then the other example is, say, the University of Alabama, and, leading up to desegregation in 1963, the fall of 62, has a quarterback that sports fans, NFL fans, Joe Namath, they've heard of, Hall of Fame NFL quarterback. It has a winning football team. And so there are broader questions around, can the University of Alabama really consider itself number one if it doesn't play against desegregated teams? So there's so many ways that sports, right, that we think about it today to where athletes are using their voice to call attention to racial discrimination and racism in America, and how sports have always been a piece of how we have these broader questions about racism in society. Yeah,
absolutely. I see that we have one of our first question in the Ask a Question queue. I'm going to get around to posing that question, but want to use that as an opportunity to just encourage other folks as our conversation goes on. Drop questions in the queue, absolutely, and we'll I'll get to those and ask those of Eddie. This going back to sort of the Seattle U example, it's so canny that you brought that up. I mean, this is the city where Elgin Baylor played his college ball at Seattle U in the 1958 NCAA Men's Championship. A fascinating history where Elgin goes up against a explicitly racist head coach in Kentucky, Adolph Rupp. I mean, his name is Adolf. That's sort of the jumping off point for assessing whether or not this guy was a racist. Check that box off. Doesn't recruit any Black players throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s when he's there. And so it's sort of this amazing history where I think civil rights gains and civil rights contests are in a way sort of symbolized and sublimated into professional sports. I'm curious about what sort of the for university presidents that were literally presiding over these anti-racist struggles that you're talking about, what institutional incentives did they have for siding with white supremacy over the movement for Black liberation that was taking place on a lot of their campuses? What were sort of the pressures that they were responding to? And why is it that we sort of are able to very, very easily sort of look back and say university presidents that were complicit in helping to continue segregating the neighborhoods that they were situated in were so clearly on the wrong side of history? But if you were to ask them in the moment, they probably would have told you, well, I'm doing it for this, this, and this, and this, these reasons, short-sighted as they were. What were some of those incentives?
Money.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, money, higher education for nonprofit is big business, and it has been, particularly post World War II. When we get into the enrollment boom, there's so much money. I mean, we're talking about millions of dollars in the 1940s and 1950s into the 60s. And so financial decisions were driving them. And oftentimes you have to look at who were on the boards of trustees, the regents at the time. I mean, these are very influential and wealthy, progressive era tycoons, or the next generation of them who have come down, right? So imagine someone like, think of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, right? And you say, okay, meat packing in Chicago, what does that mean? And you say, well, what about someone like Marshall Field? And that name stands out. And then by the time you get to the 1950s and 60s, you get into Marshall Field III and Marshall Field IV are on the University of Chicago Board of Trustees. So there's financial incentive top down to why these presidents oftentimes sided with these, like you said, short-sighted. That's a great way to describe it, short-sighted decisions that ultimately reinforce white supremacist ideas. And oftentimes what we see in the book, and I love to ask a question back to you to see if I did these individuals justice with this, you see some complexity between who they are personally, and who they're forced to be professionally, right? You see this tension oftentimes where there's this moral dilemma, oftentimes to where these presidents privately are grappling with, is this the right decision? There's also the position of the college president itself and how politicized that one academic position is, that it functions almost like an elected official. So in the same way that we can look back on our segregationist governors and see very clearly now just how wrong they were and just how racist they were, in the moment, you can sort of ask these same questions about, well, what really was driving your decisions, and who were your stakeholders that you were primarily answering to, whether you believed it or not.
Right. Yeah, and I think that was actually very well rendered in the book. You asking this, or you highlighting what you did, makes me think about sort of the differences as far as how this history played out regionally. I mean, racism in the American West and on a California university campus is morally comparable to something that may have been taking place where you're from in the South, but I'm sure the dynamics are very different. Could you speak a little bit to sort of the way that the overall struggle for racial justice is sort of fractured in a way regionally, that it works out differently in the East Coast as it might on the West, as it might in the South?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that's one of the beauties of the book that I really worked hard on, is having a national in scope and showing the regional nuance, right? I even like when I talk about the South, I'm very careful to talk about the Upper South versus the Deep South, right?
Exactly.
Myself being from Alabama has a different flavor than, say, a segregated state like Maryland. Or Virginia, where Virginia has some bad history too. But Maryland and, say, Mississippi, the dynamics are different in the sense that, you can never sleep on just how important federal pressure became on the regional fight for racial equality. And I'll just paint a quick picture again. The U.S. has always been external facing and trying to, hype itself up as, the bastion of democracy, right? Well, when you have legal segregation in your country, you're far from a democracy, right? And so what the rest of the world had long noticed, but it really became louder post World War II, is like, we just came out of a world war over this same idea, but we see the actual lynching of Black people throughout the U.S. South.
Mm-hmm.
So when you see that sort of international pressure on Washington, D.C., in turn, federal funds start to have much more they're much more aggressive in being diligent in where funding goes and what strings are tied to it.
Right.
And so you see Southern states still very much needing federal support on things. And so California picks up this image of being a racial oasis, although it's far from that in reality. But you see Maryland trying to position itself as being more progressive, while in Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, Mississippi are still quite holding on to the old Confederacy. Right. And so what does it mean when you get into the Southern Governors meeting, the Southern Governors Conference, and Maryland's governor is sitting there like, we really need to get our stuff together as the South. In Mississippi and Alabama governor saying, well, my local constituents actually want to double down on racism. And so you see this very complex racial nuance throughout the book, and academic leaders, being who they are also tied up in those same sort of conversations. And, a great point of that is looking at the presence of historically Black colleges in the South. What the president of a Black college in the South, what I show in the book, can get away with and has more leeway in Maryland is night and day compared to their contemporary that's in Georgia.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And it's kind of an accepted sort of line of argument among historians anyway, that one of the main reasons why the United States makes the rate of progress on civil rights, slow as it was, that it does in the 50s and 60s, is because of the international gaze in the heat of a Cold War, where there are proxy battles happening in Cuba and Vietnam, all across the world. The idea that the United States could sort of present itself as a leader on the question of human rights at the same time that we're seeing disenfranchisement and racial subordination across the board probably pushes governments, both local and federal, to move a little bit quicker than they would have if they were left to their own devices. Do you think that was probably the case on some of the campuses that you highlight, whether they were in the West or in the South or in the East?
Yeah, certainly. If that campus had what I call prestige striving, right? If that campus had aspirations to move up in the sort of social hierarchy, become more prominent. Today, we would say rankings, right? You want rankings and bigger endowments. But by 1950s and 60s standards, yeah, if it was an institution striving, that absolutely was a part of it, because the recruitment of international students, just as it is intentional today, it was intentional in the 30s, 40s, and 50s as well. And so there's this, the Wall Street Journal had a front page article in April 7th of 61, actually, that talked about international students on American U.S. campuses. And it's just mind-boggling. If you were to redact the date, it would sound like something we're talking about now, right? In the sense that these institutions want to position themselves as international and cultural, international in thought, culturally rich, diverse, using the same terms we use today, right? Welcoming, inclusive, when in reality, anything but, right? Those students would come from African nations and have nowhere to live, right? So absolutely. The same thing is happening for college presidents, to where there's campus pressure bottom up from student activists, but there's also this external global pressure on them as well. Right.
We had the chance to talk a little bit in the green room, the digital green room, about Quintard Taylor, who you cite in your book. Quintard Taylor as one of the preeminent, honestly, if not one of the, probably the most preeminent scholars of Black Seattle, in his book, The Forging of a Black Community. I remember reading that book when I was in college. Once upon a time, there were, I was probably one of millions of Black young adults who was looking to the university, whether it was an HBCU or a city or a university in a purportedly liberal city like Seattle, as sort of a place where we could actually go to get free, a place where we could sort of, flex, in a sense, our budding intellectual maturation, So my question is really kind of what were, you know, how optimistic are you about the American university as a space where the process of decolonization, a space where the process of anti-racism can actually manifest? And what are some of the examples that you draw from in the past that give you hope that even as sort of these inequities persist, the struggle to remedy them is not going anywhere?
Yeah. How hopeful am I? When you know history, it's challenging, but you see progress over time. So I'm optimistic, and it's something to be mindful of. The American university, I would argue, which is why this book is important, plays an outsized role in shaping American society, right? Just you reflecting on your aspirations as a college student and getting free and what Black liberation could look like and what it could mean to just open the mind. That's powerful. There aren't many entities in American society that take on that role besides the college or university. So it plays an outsized role. But I think it should play that role if it lived up to its reputation. So here's where I grapple with the American college right now, in the sense that it has all the tools to be great, right? It has everything on paper. It has the intellectual resources. In many instances, it has the financial resources to really buy into liberation, true liberation in the purest sense. And it has strived to that, and individual scholars have, some individual administrators have, but the university itself hasn't moved in that direction just yet, but it has the tools to do so. And let me give a couple of historical examples that can really be relevant to the present. So there's a free speech debacle before Berkeley. And I talk about this in the book because we also talk about the free speech movement of '64 at Berkeley. And that's sort of our starting point. But at Princeton in 1962, Berkeley, the UC system president actually reaches out to to Princeton president Robert Goheen and asks, what are your processes for dealing with free speech? Because by '62, Princeton has welcomed Alger Hiss, the former federal official who comes up on communist charges, Martin Luther King a couple times, Malcolm X has been on campus, federal officials, international controversial figures. Then all of a sudden, Mississippi's governor gets invited to speak at Princeton. At the same time that Princeton is striving to recruit Black students for the first time in its history. So you can see the dilemma, right, in the book. Like, what do you do as a college president? Like, I've got a segregationist, a white supremacist governor coming to speak on a campus while I'm actively going into Trenton, New Jersey, and Philadelphia, and Newark, saying, come to Princeton, Black children, come here, we're a great university. Right. You see the dynamic there. But what happens ultimately is Ross Barnett, the governor from Mississippi, does speak at Princeton. He actually does speak there. But the president of Princeton uses that moment to actually show how someone like Ross Barnett and his racist rhetoric isn't welcome there. It's easy for college presidents to condemn racist speech. It's another thing for them to actually live an anti-racist life on campus, embedded within the university. And what that president at Princeton, Robert Goheen, ends up doing is partnering with a local Black church, the local AME church, African Methodist Episcopal Church, to challenge racism in the Princeton township around discrimination in Princeton. He requires university contractors to have non-discrimination clauses in who they employ on campus. He requires interviews of Black people for numerous positions on campus. And ultimately, he even houses an undergraduate Black couple who's married in graduate level housing, even though there's very exclusive housing. And he has this quote that ultimately says, sometimes you have to do unequal things to give people an equal shot, right? This kind of thing. It's very interesting to watch it unfold in late '63. And so that's one example to where you say it's so necessary for everyone working within higher education settings, myself included, to not just say not just condemn something, right? Not just say Black Lives Matter, not just issue a statement that says we're shocked by the brutal murder of George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, right? That's the easy part. The next thing is to say, well, let's show how we value Black lives on campus. And there are numerous examples within the book that gives me some hope from individual college presidents that when faced with a controversy like white supremacist speaker versus actively recruiting and maintaining a diverse, welcoming climate on campus, what are you actually going to do? And so the book does give me some hope, even though moments in 2020 leave me feeling hopeless at times. Overall, when we look at history, there are moments of hope.
Absolutely. Here in Seattle, as we get ready to sort of turn to asking or posing some of the audience questions that we're getting in here, Seattle is like a lot of cities, like a Minneapolis, like New York, like Chicago, a city where we have seen the needless loss of Black life. Charlena Wiles was killed by the Seattle Police Department, a pregnant Black mother in the summer of 2017. Just miles actually from the University of Washington campus, where this year, with that memory and that pain still fresh, calls to defund not just the Seattle Police Department, but also the University of Washington Police Department, and redirecting and reinvesting some of those funds. So the movement is as alive as unfortunately the circumstances which necessitate it. Yeah. One of the questions that we have here, and I apologize for not being able to identify you by name. I think everybody was most folks were given sort of a generic sort of username and when they logged into our chat tonight. But this question, which is a really, really good one, is quote, what advice would you give to an entry-level practitioner at a school like Seattle University for advocating for disinvesting, for divesting from this lobbying and investing in communities like the Central District? What impact can you envision from grassroots, students, and low-level staff as far as the impact on that institutional financial decision? So what advice, I guess, both historically and sort of looking at these dynamics in the present, would you give for folks that are trying to really help to lead and help to push that movement to divest and reinvest?
Yeah, that's an absolutely great question. Whoever asked that, thank you for that. One thing I would say immediately to entry-level practitioners on campus, as well as students, is that it's so critical to know your institution's history, right? So there's a broader brand that SU has, just like UW has and UCLA has. There's a broader brand that's typically marketed that attracts you to the institution, but you really got to get into the institutional history. And every time I talk to college presidents, I also say the same thing, right? One of your initial things you would do moving into a new position on a college campus would have to be go to your university archives, get into your local historical society archives as well, and truly grapple with the true history of how your university has engaged with that community. And once you get into that history, especially a place like Seattle, I've already given examples from Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, Boston, LA. I mean, you can just go down a list of major US cities, and it's going to be a very similar story once you get into it. And again, what I discussed in the book very briefly, Seattle University is part of this larger national narrative around universities that have displaced communities, which is really hoarded resources. I'm talking about millions of federal dollars to do so in the process. If Seattle University is not talking about that history, is not grappling with that history every time it goes into a meeting, talking about anti-racism, talking about how can it be more conscious and more inclusive and really welcoming to all students, you have to talk about that history. If a meeting does not grapple with those facts, it's going to be ineffective. And so I would tell any practitioner that any argument that you're making, go build a case, build the evidence. The archival record is there. It's so important to get into the archives of those Black newspapers. You know, there were Black records in Seattle, even though these communities may have been displaced throughout the generations. Those records still exist. See what has been said and done throughout history. It's so absolutely critical. And that's what I try to make plain within the book, that just how clear this history shapes our present. And until we truly grapple and reckon with this history, we never can move forward the way we say we want to.
Absolutely. And, you know, where you are in Los Angeles, the LA Times has recently
Yeah.
Came forward and talked about their sort of history with racism, in essence publishing an apology within
Yes.
their own pages.
Isn't that something?
Yeah, but we also remember, well, this is the same paper that after Trump was inaugurated was running sort of flattering profiles of Richard Spencer and other folks who were sort of at the forefront of the professional white nationalist movement. So it's like, maybe y'all should figure that part of it out. You know, there are a lot of people that are probably concerned with what you may have said in 1967,
yeah.
but what you said and did in 2017 is actually a lot more relevant to this conversation that we're having right now. So I think that's a really great point. One of the other questions that we've got here, can you talk about the history of presidents of historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs? I think it took a while for Howard University to have its first Black president, but was this true for others?
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question. Seriously, grab the book because it opened the first chapter and really gets into that. It was very common for historically Black colleges, if they were established by a white missionary group or a white denomination of some religious group, they had a white leadership, right? And that really gets into historically Black colleges and universities in the legacy of this sort of white paternalistic leadership that was on those campuses initially. So that's something that's valuable and worth understanding. In particular, one particular example that I spend a lot of time on in the book is focusing on Morgan State in Baltimore. Now it's Morgan State University, a public institution, but it didn't become public until the late 1930s because the state of Maryland, of all Southern states, is actually the last state to provide a state-supported college for its Black residents, right? So Morgan State initially was private, like I said, from its founding in 1867, well into the late 1930s. And so its initial years all had white leadership. And the title for the book, actually, The Campus Color Line, actually is related to a headline in the Baltimore Afro-American, which is a prominent Black newspaper in Baltimore. And the headline criticized the white president of Morgan Morgan being a Black college because there was a skilled group of construction workers that did not get a bid to build new buildings on campus. Instead, the bids went to white companies. Mm-hmm. And the headline talked about J.O. Spencer, the white president, holding a color line at Morgan State. Mm-hmm. And so, yes, absolutely, Black presidents, Howard, Morgan, and several others had white leadership for quite some time. In fact, Tougaloo College outside of Jackson, Mississippi, actually had a white president well into the mid-1960s as well. So it is fairly recent history where you see Black leadership of Black institutions, which is a critical shift in the history of these institutions.
Absolutely. Yeah. Another question that we've got here, we have learned, actually, hold on a second, before I'm going to this question, I mean, that point about where sort of race and labor intersect with one another is really key. It reminds me of here in Seattle, we used to have, a building called the King Dome, which was imploded in the late 20th century. If it weren't for the efforts of Tyrese Scott, a labor organizer, pushing to make sure some of those contracts went to Black and Hispanic, Asian American workers, that would have been a monument to segregation that would have been constructed in the King Dome. And so this obviously plays itself out in lots of different kinds of ways. Wow. This next question here is sort of, I think, bringing it back to the present. What have we learned about and seen? We have learned about and seen images of the violent protests to the integration of primary schools, but were there very large public demonstrations at colleges as well against Black students attending for the first time? And these struggles for affirmative action being a lightning rod in the present, what did those struggles sort of look like in the past as far as demonstrations against Black students attending for the first time?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for asking that. Some of the higher education, there are a few examples, and I'll just say 1956, the University of Alabama actually has a racial uprising on campus when one Black student, a Black woman, Arthurina Lucy, is admitted She actually is enrolled for 3 days before the trustees actually expel her and cite her as the cause for the actual anti-Black riot against her that came on campus, right? That's a notable example. The University of Mississippi may be the most notorious example. In September, the last day of September in 1962, roughly a few thousand people gather on that campus to protest James Meredith enrolling as the first Black student at the University of Mississippi. Mm-hmm. And then briefly also in January 61, there's also a racial riot at the University of Georgia. Mm-hmm. So it's one of those things to where violent resistance is not as prominent within higher education history, but when it did occur, it was significant. Mm-hmm. I think what our historical memory tends to lean to primary schools because of just how young the individual actors are, and just how even dismaying that was even in the 50s and 60s. But particularly when we think about higher education, a lot of that same violence was occurring, and that's what was in the back of the minds of a number of these college presidents as well. In fact, 2 people were killed at the University of Mississippi in 1963 during the race riot to keep James Meredith out. So people actually lost their lives resisting desegregation.
Right. I mean, for a lot of Seattleites, I think it can be really eye-opening to sort of look at the way these dynamics have played out, because for so long in Seattle, I think we have like the air of the city where those kind of conflicts don't happen. I think the actuality, when you look at the historical record here, is that like most things that happen in Seattle, the racism here has been very passive-aggressive. So you have these instances like in the early 60s here, the UW football team that won a couple of Rose Bowls, I think in 1960 and 61. One of the players, Joe Jones, is a fullback who actually plays in the game despite having appendicitis a couple of weeks prior. Wow. Goes down to California, the Huskies win the Rose Bowl, comes back and is unable to actually rent an apartment, is turned away at 6 apartment homes. This is 8 years before the open housing ordinance is passed. Yeah. And so you have, kind of this strange paradox of this college student being celebrated in, this field, and, coming back home to, in essence, a segregated city, but one that is segregated in the law, if not in these kinds of demonstrations. I mean, have you, personally had the opportunity to attend a lot of the protests that have been taking shape over the last 3 or 4 months since George Floyd was murdered? Yeah. What was that experience like for you as somebody who's a historian looking at just how this continuity and this thread has remained pretty consistent?
Yeah, it was powerful to be a part of it, and to actually get out into the streets this summer and see it, particularly knowing that it's occurring during a public health pandemic as well. Mm-hmm. So there's so many dynamic moments happening, and I have a vision in my mind, becoming evening and seeing the police presence was so high at particular demonstrations that I was actually got out and was able to see this summer, and it just made me think historically about how much of this moment feels like what it must have felt like during the 1960s, right? Mm-hmm. Because what I found in my research, and I document in the book, that there are also faculty that are also involved in these demonstrations from the 60s, and they're trying to balance their teaching, their research, alongside being actively engaged in the community. And the parallels to what I'm seeing historically and what we're seeing today are just so, Shaun, it leaves me speechless. It almost makes me better understand how particular scholars who I know came of age during the 1960s don't write about the 1960s because they lived it, right? Right. I oftentimes think of myself as wondering, would I ever 20, 30 years down the road in my career think to look back historically on 2020? And I'm not sure I will. I'm not sure if I would, because I'm living this moment.
Right. Yeah. And we're gonna getting ready to sort of wrap up here, but I had a couple more questions for you.
Sure. Yeah.
In your book, The Campus Color Line, you are writing and sort of standing in a lot of ways on the shoulders of, as you mentioned, a lot of other scholars who have been writing about and thinking about racial justice. Who are some of the scholars that you feel really inspired your book, The Campus Color Line? Other scholars that you took and take a lot from, and continued to have to sort of grapple with and be in conversation with as you were researching and writing your own book?
Yeah, that's probably one of my favorite questions, right? Because we know that everything we do builds on people who've come before you. And so a few names that immediately come to mind, I would say Jelani Favors, historian. He's down in Georgia right now. He's written a fascinating book, an award-winning book, let me add, about historically Black colleges and how those institutions have fostered Black student activism from their inception, not just limited to the 50s and 60s. And so reading his work going back to the 1800s on these Black campuses, even knowing the previous question about white leadership and being paternalistic and trying to suppress that Black student activism, knowing how these Black colleges still found a way, these Black activists, to engage activism for over a century. Just fascinating work. I think about that. Stephen Bradley, who's a historian down at Loyola Marymount here in LA, just fascinating work, has written a couple books focused on Ivy League institutions and Black student activism on those campuses. And ultimately, he grapples with this question of these individuals who have a sizable amount of privilege to be at an Ivy League institution, particularly in the 1960s and 70s, when they're just admitting Black students in bulk, but still feel the need to engage the Black freedom struggle for people that they've never met or people so far away from them, right? So there's this idea of, do you still have this moral obligation to engage the movement, even though you're in this sort of ivory tower, if you will? I think about Joy Williamson Lott, who is a professor at the University of Washington. I have to give her a shout out, who has a phenomenal body of work on Black student activism, 3 books out. Most recent book being about the Black South and the overall struggle to reassess the social order in the South. There's James Anderson at the University of Illinois, fascinating historian who's written The Education of Blacks in the South. If you want to know the bare basics, just a phenomenal, powerful work, check that out. As well as Vanessa Siddle Walker, who's a professor at Emory University in Atlanta, who does some fascinating work in the K-12 sector historically, but on Black education, knowing that historically Black colleges and K-12 Black schools were intricately linked together. So, I mean, those are just some people who immediately come to mind, some phenomenal historians. And of course, Quintard Taylor, because I've written about, the Black West and the universities in the West, and you can't write about the Black West and the overall freedom struggle without citing his work and reading his work 2, 3, 4 times, hands down, easily.
Yeah, Quintard is Professor Taylor. I should call him. We'll put some respect on his name. He is a titan for sure. Yeah. Last question. So we're here in Seattle. The Seattle Storm in the WNBA Finals. I think they won today, and it looks like they're going to take it home. You're down in LA. Yeah. Are you a Laker fan, and how do you feel about them benefiting from all these injuries that look like they're getting ready to chop down Miami in this finals here?
Yeah, we are competing against the Lake Show right now, but I'm not a Laker fan. Let me be clear about that. Let me
all right
say that up front. I'm not a Laker fan. I do have some admiration for LeBron James's career to still perform at the level he performs in his 17th year in the NBA. That's high level to play professional for half your life. But yeah, they are taking advantage of the injuries. They're going to get a ring. It's going to be a parade at some point. I'll probably get a T-shirt or something, but I'm no Lakers fan.
You seem already over it, which is good. You're winning some points with me here. Eddie, thank you so much, man. It was great to talk with you. The Campus Color Line, really encourage everybody else who's been joining us on this call to go and check that book out. And thank you, Eddie, so much for joining us, for everybody who's joining us on this call into Town Hall as well.
Shaun, my pleasure. Thank you, Town Hall Seattle, for having me. This has been a great conversation, seriously.
Yeah, thank you both so much. Dr. Cole, thank you for your research and insight into this topic. I think it's really important that we know this history. And Shaun, we always love having you. It's great to have you as a leader in this city. We love hearing your voice. I am not a Lakers fan either, but I do still feel such a connection with Kobe, and you just reminded me of Kobe again, and I'm just so sad still about losing him this year. That's just an aside, sorry. But yeah, I want to encourage everyone to purchase the book here through the links that we have on this stream. That's going to take you right over to Third Place, so you can support a local bookstore. If you're interested in more town hall content, you can follow this Crowdcast channel. And we will see everybody again soon. Thank you both again so much. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I just want to say that one of the fascinating things about the book coming out, particularly in this pandemic, is that please support independent bookstores. Seriously, I try my best to order my books through independent bookstores who are just doing us all a service as we sit at home and read. Support them, support them, support them. So thank you to Third Place Books.
Great, thank you. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.
Later,
Thank you,
Shaun. Bye-bye. Thanks, Eddie.
Peace.